Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending. We're just going to wait a minute here for others to be able to join the room. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome today to the webinar on addressing blended family and trauma issues with affectional and gender minority parents. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Ann Murphy, and I'm the co-director of the MHTTC, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. The MHTTC, oh, next slide, Anthony, if you don't mind. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental health conditions. We encourage you to visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. And then you can visit our regional network page by clicking on the tab that says Find Your Center and clicking on Northeast and Caribbean. You can also sign up to receive notifications of our activities at the bit.ly link that's on the screen, or if you go to our website, you can also scroll down to the bottom and click Connect with us and sign up to receive our notifications there. We did want to let you know that we are required by our funder, by SAMHSA, to evaluate our services, and we rely heavily on your input and your feedback in order to inform future activities. So we do ask that you complete the survey that you'll be redirected to after the completion of this webinar. We'll also include a QR code at the bottom, on one of the final slides that you can also utilize to get to our survey. I did want to take just a second here to provide a little bit more information about the survey because we've gotten some questions about it. So just very quickly, the survey is quite brief. It really only takes a minute or less to complete. It does, however, ask you for information at the beginning to create a personal code, and it asks for I believe the first and last number of your Social Security and the first letter of your mother's maiden name and the last letter of your mother's maiden name, or something to that effect. Some people are uncomfortable providing that specific information. So I did want to let you know that if you would prefer to pick different numbers or a different name to utilize, you are welcome to do that. We're not, it's just intended to kind of assign a code number to you. So it's up to you if you want to select different letters or numbers. We're more interested in your feedback than the code that you create for yourself. And if you have any other questions, you can inquire with us. We also wanted to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and we will post a link to the recording as well as to the presenter slides on our website, usually within a day or two after the completion of the webinar. We will send you a link to that posting so you have access to both the recording and to the slides following the webinar. The webinar will be interactive, so we encourage you to ask questions of the presenter. You can do that using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Those questions will be visible both to the panelists and to the other attendees, and we will get to those at the end as time permits. You can also post questions in the chat box. And in the chat box, you have flexibility over who you want your comments to be visible to. So there's a drop-down arrow, and you can choose to make your questions or comments available only to the presenter and panelists, or you can make them available to everyone. There may also be poll questions that we present to you. Thank you. Okay, now let's get to why you're all here for the actual webinar. I want to introduce to you and welcome Dr. Anthony Zazzarino. He's an assistant professor at Rutgers University in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. He's currently a core faculty member within the department and field experience coordinator for the counselor education and supervision track. Previously, Dr. Zazzarino provided instruction for professional education courses for New Jersey's supportive housing agencies, implementing community support services. He actively presents at local, state, national, and international conferences related to affectional and gender minorities, multiculturalism, psychiatric rehabilitation methods, counseling services, housing, and supervision practices. In addition to his work at Rutgers, Dr. Zazzarino continues to conduct clinical work by facilitating group therapy for adolescents and adults at an intensive outpatient program, providing outpatient counseling services at his private practice, and providing clinical supervision for counselors who are in need of supervised clinical hours in the state of New Jersey. So with that, I will now turn it over to Dr. Zazzarino to provide the webinar.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you all for being here today for what is the 6th and final webinar in the Affectional and Gender Diversity webinar series. For those of you who have been here before, thank you for coming back. For those of you that this is your first time, where have you been? No. Thank you for being here today. And some of the stuff that we're going to talk about, I might reference to other webinars, and just know that you can always go on and watch and listen to the webinars at your own leisure. So today's topic, I think, is a really interesting topic that we're going to discuss, just like I feel like they all are, but also need to preface it with the information that you're going to get today really is just the beginning of your learning journey, I think, when it comes to working with affectional and gender diverse families. So thank you for being here, and know that the learning process with this should continue after this webinar. So today we are going to talk briefly about understanding the multiple cultural identities of parents who identify as affectional and gender minorities. We will begin to discuss how past relationships and traumatic experiences, feelings of oppression and privilege do shape the development as a person and as a parent. And hopefully by the end of this, we will leave with some strategies for supporting affectional and gender diverse families. And thank you for posting the link. So in the link that was posted, and I always start these topics off just with a really brief conversation about language. Some of you might be hearing the word affectional identity and think to yourself, what is that? Where did that come from? I will say that if you are more aware of the term sexual identity, you're probably around the same period of understanding as the majority of the population, because this term affectional identity is really a newer term that's been coined over the past few months. But really, if you look at that webinar, it's an interesting change, I think, that comes from a more strengths-focused approach, where the word affectional identity is geared more towards the multiple layers of connection between two people and does not just stigmatize or situate the connection in the term sex or sexual. And that's really a big shift, and that's in that PowerPoint. Along with other terminology that we might talk about today, we know that one of the things I'm consciously aware of is trying to separate out the term affectional identity with gender identity, and trying not to use, as much as I can, the acronym LGBTQ+. For me, and for a lot of what I'm seeing in the research, is that we tend to lump both groups together as one and fail to recognize the unique experience of affectional individuals that identify as an affectional minority and individuals that identify as a gender minority. Who we love is very different from who we are. And I think if we can begin to separate those two out, and it starts with our language, we can begin to really look at those unique experiences a little bit closer. So what do I have up here is just some general guidelines, which is also in the one PowerPoint on language. I wanted to start with this just to really reinforce that the language is constantly evolving. What we need to do is just become more self-aware. And thank you for doing number 2, right, with catching yourself and replacing it earlier when you said sexual identity, not affectional identity. And I will also probably catch myself and replace it today. Part of this is that our language is constantly evolving and we need to be more aware, but also be more mindful if we do mess up that it's okay, let's just catch ourselves, replace it, and keep practicing without judgment. For many of us, we've lived many years using certain words and certain phrases, so to have an expectation that we're just going to switch over in our language overnight is not very realistic. And the more that we hold on and the more that we place judgment on certain words, the longer they're going to stay. So that keep practicing without judgment is really important here. When we're with clients, right, and when we're with people that we're providing services to, in terms of language, it's really important to ask them how they identify. And one of the things that I do when I'm working with people is I'll open up a conversation with somebody that I'm meeting for the first time and say, you know, hi, my name is Anthony. I go by the pronouns of he, him, and his, and I'm here to work with you today. I don't necessarily ask them immediately, well, what pronouns do you use? But by opening up that dialogue and announcing my pronouns, if that person feels comfortable, they will share that with me. And in general conversation, when we just asking about affectional identity, and you know, if the terms that they use, do not assume that you know what those terms mean, because what I find is that even when I think I believe what a certain term means, right, like demisexual or pangender, I might not know exactly how that person perceives that term. So when we're talking about language, just don't assume, just like we would with anything else. You know, if we were working with somebody who had anxiety and said, you know, I'm feeling really anxious today, I wouldn't say, okay, I know what anxiety is, let me move on. I more so would say, okay, can you tell me what anxiety feels like for you? What does it mean for you to feel anxious right now? And I think we need to look at that and use the language similarly when we're working within this population. And at the end of the day, if they identify with a term, even if we don't think that that's the right term, for instance, maybe they're saying that they are pansexual and we believe that they're actually bisexual, we need to empower and validate the individual in the language that they're comfortable with using, so use their language. So that really is a whole hour of language rolled into 5 minutes, but I do encourage you all to take a look at that video, because if we are working with individuals, if we're working with family members and people that identify as an affectional or gender minority, we need to understand how to use appropriate language and the value of doing that. So before we even get into looking at families, I think we definitely have to just really briefly touch on different types of relationships. And I was hesitant to start with this because I don't want people to believe that only individuals that identify as an affectional or gender minority are in these types of relationships. However, historically, they are at higher rates within this population. So it really is important to just quickly address this. This could be a whole nother separate conversation and a whole nother separate topic, but just thinking in terms of when we're working with families, right? They might be in these types of relationships, and what do we know about them? How much awareness do we have? And as we'll talk about later on, how much bias do we have regarding some of this? So again, these types of relationships in terms of consensual non-monogamous relationships are not just strictly found and are not just strictly seen within the affectional and gender diverse communities. However, they are at higher rates. So when we're talking about different types of relationships, which then might ultimately lead to working with families, we're looking at individuals that might identify as being in an open relationship, where I might be with one partner and still have the ability and the permission to seek connections with other individuals, maybe one, maybe two. I might be in a polyamorous relationship or a triad or a throuple where it's three people, right? So it might be me, my partner, and another partner. And maybe it's we're in a triad forever. Maybe we're in a triad for a couple weeks, and we get to define that. Or a quad where it's four individuals in a relationship. And then a newer term I think that's come out is monogamish, where, you know, me and my partner are strictly monogamous. We are strictly in a committed monogamous relationship, unless we go to like Paris, right? And we're in Paris and, you know, it's a whole nother country, then maybe we can be open just in Paris. So we're monogamous most of the time. Then you have another type of relationship, which typically falls under the acronym of BDSM. And for those of you who are not quite fully aware of what BDSM stands for, it is the practice of bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadomasochism. And I think when we're looking at this type of relationship as well, there's a lot of stigma that's associated with BDSM relationships or even consensual non-monogamous relationships. So what I want us to do is in the chat, so if you're away from your computer, just come back for a couple seconds. And in the chat box, I just want you to write the first word or two that comes to mind when you heard or when you saw this slide of open relationships, polyamorous relationships, triads, quads, monogamish, or BDSM. Just type in the chat box, what's the first word or two that comes to mind with that? Love, 50 Shades of Grey, whips, community and people. Okay, acceptance, stereotypes, love. Ooh, wow, this is the most active group I have had in the chat box, so thank you. So active, I'm struggling to keep up. New generational, free, sister, she's a member, boundaries, relationships, love, communication, college, preference, relational. Freedom to do things. Absolutely. Thank you so much for going through this. The reason I asked you all to do that, and when I do this sometimes in an in-person training, I'll have cards laid out ahead of time at different tables, and on index cards I'll have different words or even different pictures, and I ask them to write the first thing down on the back side of the card that comes to mind, and then I'll collect them and then I'll read them. And typically what I'll see, because we're not in this conversation yet, is that there's slightly more stigmatized words. Some of the terms and some of the things that I will read are more in line with more stigmatized language, with weird, confusing, unique even. I always get, and thank you for doing this in here, 50 Shades of Grey. Sometimes when I talk about what types of trainings I do to my mom, she then says, oh, like that 50 Shades of Grey book? And then I have to educate her a little bit more. Why this is so important is because we need to understand our own biases and how our biases might impact our actions. Because it could skew how we work with people. And historically, what's misunderstood that individuals within a consensual non-monogamous relationship or a BDSM relationship actually have higher rates of trust and communication within their relationship, which is really the exact opposite of what some of the words and some of the views are when we do these trainings in person. So thank you for going through that, because we know, right, that from a relationship may or may not create a family. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the time today. So families, right? Affectional and gender minority families in numbers. Higher rates than we or that historically people would believe. So we're looking at anywhere between 48% of women and 20% of men who identify as an affectional or gender minority are raising approximately 2 to 3 million children under the age of 18. And I'll say that these statistics come from some research, and all the references are going to be at the back of the PowerPoint from 2017, I'm sorry. So these numbers are most likely a little bit higher. Also, we know that the numbers keep on rising, right? So 1.4% of all adopted children under the age of 18 in the United States are being raised by affectional and gender diverse individuals. And we'll talk about in a little bit where some of these numbers might be headed to and what might be going on that really does impact these numbers. What is really promising, though, is that the shift in public opinion has been totally changed. So back in 2015, which there was a really good study that looked at the perception of individuals and their view of affectional and gender diverse families. So we looked at the figure where 58% of the United States view that gay and lesbian relationships are morally acceptable. Sorry about that. But most importantly, we saw the number of the percentage of Americans who supported same-sex couples should have the legal right to adopt children. And I have some issue with the term same-sex, but this is a statistic that comes straight from this research. So I will continue to use that language to quote it accurately. So in 1992, we were looking at 29%, and then in 2014, that figure was up to 63%, and even higher for marriage among same-sex couples. So we know that these numbers are getting better, that perception is getting a little bit better. So what do we see as the rates get a little bit higher and perception gets a little bit better? We might see more choices and options for affectional and gender minority couples to become parents, right? However, with more choices is going to come its own set of challenges and obstacles. And that's when we all, might be working with families or even just the children of affectional and gender diverse parents, and we might have a greater rate or greater incidence of working with this population. We will continue to see a generational shift, right? Working with teens right now, though I get confused sometimes with some of the words that they use and some of the language and some of their social media, and I still am not a fan of TikTok. I apologize if anybody in here is. I am hopeful at the level of acceptance and just flexibility when it comes to talking about affectional and gender identity. And that to me is a promising thing to see in terms of our teens and looking at how that could shift the work that we do over the next few years and next few generations. And what are we seeing more of? We're seeing a lot more affectional and gender minority blended families. We see with more families, we need to see a change in family resources and services, right? So what we need to start to do a little bit more is creating those necessary resources. And we're going to talk about where and maybe why those resources are important. And increase in education and training. So this is really sad for me to say, but even in grad school, completing a 60-credit master's degree in a pretty good graduate program, I had 1 week of education on the LGBTQ plus population, which happened to fall in the multicultural class. Nowhere did I ever touch on working with LGBTQ couples or LGBTQ families, not even in my family therapy class. So for me, and like many other people, what we see in the field is we have to seek out our own training and our own education, like this, right? So thank you for taking an hour out of your week and out of your day to seek out additional training, because workshops like this, and like I said, there's a lot more that needs to get done, is really the beginning of our competence in our education. We need to be active learners when we're working with this population. So we're going to do a quick poll here. So we're going to pose a poll question. So very simple. So if you're away from your computer, again, like making something to eat, just come right back. I just want you to click on how many of you know an affectional or gender minority family, personally or professionally. How many of you know people that identify as either affectional or gender minority that raise children or are, oh man, I can't vote, or are creating a family? So we're going to give you about 5 seconds. I just wanted to poll and see how many in terms of the percentage here. All right, let's see the result. Okay, so 77% of us, of the people who responded do know. So 60 of us know, and 18% don't know. So what I will say is to that 60 people here that do know, thank you. My memory faded with the numbers. With the 60 people that do know, thank you. Thank you for interacting and being a part of that family. And I would encourage you to speak to those individuals about what their experience has been like, because sometimes by understanding that unique experience, it really does shape the way we provide services. And for those of you who don't, that's okay. I think you will know more and more as time goes on. And I would encourage you to talk to peers and talk to friends that do know and try to understand those unique experiences. But yeah, this is something that is definitely changing, and we're seeing a lot of higher numbers. So I think we will be seeing more and more of this. Okay. So sadly, I think we know that even though views of affectional and gender minority individuals have been shifting, and I just gave you that statistic, we also know that there is still clear discrimination prevalent for this population. I only have 30 minutes left. And I cannot get into political and religious possibilities behind this number, but we just have to be aware that that it's happening. So, and it's happening and impacting on these different levels, right? So many affectional and gender minority parents still experience social victimization, stigmatization, and harassment due to their non-traditional family structure. And that really impacts their daily living and their careers. Something and I hate to say this, but, you know, even thinking, and I know the federal government is slow to change things, but I was thinking about when Anne was talking about the evaluations and that your mother's first name or first initial, first name and last name. And I thought to myself, well, what if I was a young adult who was raised by two dads? How would I feel being asked that question, right? And I also think about it with children sometimes, or even family members in schools, where some schools still do daddy-daughter dances, or mommy-son balls, and, you know, seeing those really regimented, gender-specific parent activities, and how that is really a sign of stigma, you know, to stigmatize affectional and gender minority families. And we're working through it, right? We can only, you know, continue to advocate, make changes, and we will continue to do that. The perceived discrimination continues to be a risk factor for emotional and behavioral problems across the lifespan, making it more difficult to work through parental stress, right? So as we continue to feel the victimization, and we continue to feel that harassment from not only due to that non-traditional family structure, but just from people that are just not aware, that stress continues to build up and becomes a risk factor for other emotional and behavioral problems, both individually, and then what happens when two individuals then come together and then they have another layer from a family perspective. And sadly, we often hear that affectional and gender minority parents hear criticism that they are selfish, damaging, or dangerous for children. There's experiences of heterosexism that continue to be associated with poor psychological outcomes in affectional and gender minority parents. So there's a couple things. I was doing some extra research and came across some of these myths about LGBTQ plus parents, and where I see this comment about often hear criticism of they being selfish and damaging is when we look at affectional or gender diverse adults who might have had that traditional marriage with the child and then have come out later in life and then want to create a family with the same gender partner. And how does that feel to the family? And then that's where you hear a lot of that criticism. There's also a lot of myths out there that individuals that identify as an affectional gender minority parent might be hearing from some of those family members. So I just kind of wanted to go through 5 quick myths just to highlight that they are out there and that they are not true, right? So one of the most biggest misconceptions is that a child needs a mother and father. What studies have showed is that there's equally good outcomes from children of gay or lesbian parents as those with a mother and father. So that myth is completely not true. A second misconception that often people hear is that gay people cannot provide stable homes. Luckily, grounded in the research, there really has been no study that's found anything unstable about the families created by gay or lesbian people or individuals that identify as gender diverse or gender minority. The third misconception is that gay people pose a risk of child sexual abuse. And these are myths that the Adoptions from the Heart, there's from PFLAG have released of common myths from 2019. So when I was reading this, I was like, oh, this has got to be from like the 80s, right? And unfortunately, that's not true, right? So we know that there are still people who say these things, and affectional and gender diverse parents have to hear these things, and what does it do for that person in terms of feeling that they are beginning to blame themselves or thinking that they are inadequate, those internalized senses of stigma that then develops. So that misconception number 3, that gay people pose a risk of child abuse, and there is simply no basis behind this harmful and pervasive claim. A 4th one, that being raised by gay parents will cause a kid to be gay. Again, not a valid statement at all. So, and then the last one is kids of a gay parent will get picked on. Unfortunately, kids are, with any parent can get picked on, but or the individual's affectional orientation or gender orientation typically is not the number 1 cause for bullying. So I read those 5 statements just because it still shocks me that they're prevalent, but mostly because to highlight what are some of those experiences of social victimization and stigma feel like? What does it feel like for a person to be bombarded with some of these myths that maybe they heard of when they were younger growing up, or maybe when they're, trying to talk to family members, that's what's being bombarded to them. I always say this in these trainings, I'm very fortunate to be in the Northeast in New Jersey. But if anybody else in here is from New Jersey, we also know that not all of New Jersey is as liberal and open and accepting, and makes me think of people from other parts of the country that we know are definitely not as liberal and open as and accepting. So sometimes I think, well, this situation can't be happening, but then I think it could be happening because of people's values and beliefs and where people are from. And if you've been in any of my other trainings, I've brought up minority stress a lot, but I think in terms of working with parents and working with families, it's understanding the multiple levels of minority stress that has an impact, right? So when we hear some of those statements, right, that's that external stigma, that individual external stigma that can and ultimately does promote some sort of internal views or bias or shame or guilt. If we have 2 people that both experience that and now we're coming together, now we have a whole nother layer. So it's like an onion, right, where we have multiple layers of trying to peel back and work through some of the trauma from the individual level and now as a family level, what that also adds. Okay, so we're a family, now what? This is where it begins to understanding some of the strategies and what we need to do to really help support affectional and gender diverse parents and families. So extended family concerns about the child and the challenges they will encounter as a family. So trying to help people just understand what those extended family concerns are. And this is where we often talk about when I talked about the coming out process, really having an honest conversation. What will your family think? What will your family talk about? What are your family's values? The second one, so encounters with care professionals who invade this choice with a lack of support, heterosexism, and hostility. I would like to think that all practitioners that are in this field, in the behavioral health care field, are really warm, open, and accepting and provide unconditional positive regard. Unfortunately, I know that's not to be true. And this is where I think sometimes it goes back to language. And I will have a very honest story where just 2 weeks ago, I was running a group with adults, and I hadn't run a group with them in a while. But one of the guys in the group mentioned just getting married and having some conflict and is no longer, and had to move out. And my next question was, oh, well, what does your wife think or what does your wife feel? And I had to stop myself. And again, I stopped myself. I apologized to the group and I corrected it and provided some education as to why asking about your wife was was a heterosexist comment, and then had to take a time afterwards to kind of process that and process where that came from for me, and continuing to check our language, right? So even though I was not intentionally being hurtful, my words were, and needing to validate if anybody was hurt, and processing that, because using more common terms like partner is a much better term, because then I'm not projecting what that is, and that's when we're talking about heterosexism. The emotional distancing from family members who choose not to accept to be a part of the relationship, child, or the family dynamic. So thinking about all the stressors that comes into play. What does it feel like to have your mom, your dad, your cousins, your brothers say, yeah, I hear this one, I support you for who you are, I just don't want to be a part of it. So you're dealing with a lot of that, even emotionally. I need to emotionally distance myself from that, from my family of origin. Then we know that as I begin to distance myself and I don't have that support, you begin to have feelings of stress and isolation, as well as an overwhelming void of support, advice, and help navigating the parenting world. Typically, and I can't lie, I do not have kids, but when I work with families and when I work with couples and my friends and they have parent questions, they typically go to their parents. What did you do when this was going on? How can I handle this? And unfortunately, if you distance yourself from your family of origin, you don't have that ability to turn to them or seek that support or seek that advice, and you start to feel isolated. And then the fifth one, experience the loss of other affectional and gender minority friends and community who do not engage in kid-friendly activities and are thus unable to provide the necessary support. I would like to change this as well, because it's not just affectional and gender minority friends. I think it's when people start having children and developing families, friends who don't have children, I think there is that separation just as that natural occurrence. But what's really difficult is when it is individuals that people might view them as my chosen family, right? So maybe a parent had some issues with coming out earlier in life and had already distanced themselves from family members and had kind of worked through all of that trauma and really created a nice chosen family for them, and they decided to start having kids, and then that chosen family then separates because, maybe they don't want to be around kids, or maybe they still want to go out to the bars and to late night dinners, and now we're looking at that, the additional trauma of now I'm separating from my chosen family, and what does that really do? That really decreases the amount of protective factors and support systems in somebody's life during the time where having children is such a stressful situation, right? We talk about lack of sleep. We talk about not knowing what to do, that uncertainty. All of that brings so much stress to a person's life. And we can see that all that lack of support really limits the protective factors for the individuals. So how do we support families? We need to check our own biases first, off and foremost, which we started to do already. We need to understand that the individuals are very strong, right, and come from a strengths perspective, and then understand your role. So there's a couple of things that we'll talk about today, and I actually will give a really quick case vignette, and I will give a disclaimer that understanding your role in all of this is really important, right? So if you are, a practitioner, maybe with a bachelor's degree, high school diploma, master's degree, just supporting individuals in different settings, we need to understand that sometimes our role is to just create that really nice, nurturing, unconditional, positive regard, safe environment, and then maybe create a nice warm handoff with a licensed clinician to do some deeper work. that our role sometimes is not to do everything, right? If we're not a licensed clinician, we do not do licensed clinician work. And I think that's really important in this because of the layers of trauma that might come out. So what do they need, right? So one of the things might be to make a referral or provide resources to couples and marriage counseling. That in itself is a really difficult process because trying to find a competent counselor or a competent licensed clinical social worker or a competent licensed marriage and family therapist that has training and experience working with affectional and gendered minority families is really difficult. And we all know that the relationship you build really helps create that change. We also know that just like many new marriages and many new relationships, there's a lot of situations that people have to work with and work through. So when we know that there are higher rates of victimization and harassment and oppression and discrimination from an individual basis, and we know that when they come together, we're going to amplify those minority stresses, we know that referrals to counseling would be such an important and critical aspect to provide. It also allows for that support system, right, that might have already been taken away. It allows to have that family to have some type of support. We also know that we need to provide opportunities for family and community support. This is where it's so important to understand your resources in your community. And for maybe some parts of this country, the resources might be online. PFLAG, parents and families of, oh my gosh, I just drew a blank. PFLAG, we'll get to that in a second. PFLAG is a great resource, and it helps the individuals work on strengthening the couple's support from family and friends. And when I say family, again, I think I'm also talking about biological family and chosen family. And then also social support, right? We need to build back in those protective factors. We need to build it back in those support systems, the support systems of love, understanding, and care. And I think that's where many of us play a really big role, is helping. Even if we can't do it within our agencies or within our practices, what do we know in the community? How do we foster these types of resources? And sometimes they might not be there, and you have to be the one who starts it. And that's okay too. Ooh, went too quick. So why is the connection to the larger community so important? It really helps sometimes build those relationships with other affectional and gender minority parent families, which reemerges that connection to a sense of community. Support groups, social support, like I said, is a protective factor, and it helps reduce the minority stress and the impact of that minority stress. And all of this really provides to not only the parents, but the children an opportunity to engage with other families that are that could be similar to them and are in an affirming environment. There's nothing more exciting to hear from a kid than to hear them say, oh, that family's just like me. And it makes the children feel less different and begins to help them feel like their family is just like other families. And I think that's such an important role, and we'll talk about understanding and exploring the needs of children in a little bit. And you all, providers, might have to create that safe, affirming space for diverse, affectional, and gender minority parent families to interact with one another. And I hate to say this, but sometimes, because I think in other trainings I've said that just because I might be gay or a lesbian or transgender does not mean that I only want to socialize and be friends with only gay, lesbian, or transgender individuals. In this situation, it is really helpful to have at least one other affectional gender minority parent or family to be safe, to be friends with and support each other because of those multiple layers of minority stress and those unique experiences. It really is extremely helpful in this capacity. We also must consider the needs of the children within the family. Like I said, as some families and some individuals separate from their own biological family or even their chosen family, children may view themselves as alone and without family. And, especially when it comes time to holidays and they hear stories in school, they might start to feel a little isolated and down themselves. They also might view themselves as a minority among their peer groups due to the affectional and gender minority status of the parents. And I said that comes into play a lot of times when schools still do these gender-specific activities, which I can only say for New Jersey. I know that's shifting, but I know in Texas, my really good friend, their school system still does a daddy-daughter dance. And then when I have this conversation with her, her husband is on the school board, I said, well, what about changing it? Like, when we have these conversations, then the reaction is, well, it's a daddy-daughter dance or a special person dance. And just the feelings, I think, that might come along with that. And I just don't understand why they just don't call it a special person's dance. But that's not for me to change the Board of Ed down there. And then also understanding that, yes, that maybe sometimes children also do need that type of support, but not assume that just because they are a child of an affectional and gender diverse individual that support or that counseling support is really always needed, because just like any other child, children are extremely resilient individuals. And just because of their affectional and gender diverse parents does not always mean that they need additional support themselves. So now, if you are a licensed clinician and you are doing some good work, or you're looking to do some good work with gender and affectional minority families, it goes back to the wonderful genogram. Genograms are, or what a lot of people like to refer to them as, a family tree. They are critical within family therapy theories. But a lot of the research is now shifting genograms to integrate the needs of cultural diverse families. And even more recently, looking at providing genograms for affectional and gender minority-led families. It really helps them to understand their individual members' identity as well as understand the larger community. And it's been very, very helpful. I won't go through this brief vignette. You will have the slides. And I have to make sure that this is, it should be in the reference too. This is coming out of a counseling workbook. But here's a small vignette that you can all read on your own time. And then it comes with a Genogram Legend that is diverse in its symbols, colors, and making sure that we account for cisgender, transgender, so we're accounting for gender identity. I don't know where that should be a green square as well. And these are typical symbols in a family tree or a genogram in terms of a hostile relationship, close relationship, distant. So those are pretty concrete. But based on that example, here would just be a mock-up of that vignette genogram. And it comes with some just reflective questions that you can use to guide discussion, right? Ultimately, if you're using a genogram, and again, understanding your role, right? So this would be more for licensed clinical individuals, because there are some there will be some responses and some trauma, and there could be, I should say. And using these reflective questions to help guide conversation and really guide the conversation about the individual's family of origin. You can see here we have family 1 and family 2. And then when they came together, then looking at their whole overall system. It's been a newer, really helpful way to guide conversation. And then when you're done, really just using a strengths-based approach to move forward and facilitating parent-led conversations about the uniqueness of the family. As a licensed clinician as well, highlighting the sources of support available within the extended family and the community, and understanding, just like practitioners, understanding the resources that are in the community and making sure that whatever resource you provide is an affirming resource, is an open resource, and is an active resource, right? We don't want to provide referrals to people who already are hesitant to go somewhere and they're no longer open, or it's not an affirming resource. That's definitely not good. We need to check our resources. And then just some professional readings and other resources if you are really interested in understanding some more. The Handbook of LGBT Affirmative Couple and Family Therapy is really helpful. Modern Families, Stories of Extraordinary Journeys is really helpful. And then Mindfulness and Acceptance for Gender and Sexual Minorities is really helpful. And then some other online resources. We have the Family Equality Council, we have PFLAG, and then we have the Gay Parent LGBT magazine are some really great resources. And then all the references are back here too. If there's anything more that you want to follow up on before we get to question and answer, here's our contact information, like Anne had mentioned earlier, related to our email, our website, and I will leave it on this page because this is where you can screenshot to do your evaluation. So with that, we have, one more minute, I do apologize. There are some books on PFLAG's website and on, and if you go into the webinar that I did on gender diversity, there's some really good resources, and on the Coming Out webinar, there's some really good resources that are developmentally appropriate for teens and for children related to having conversations about affectional identity and gender identity and gender affirmation. Absolutely.
Thank you, Anthony. And in our last 30 seconds or so, do you also have any suggestions around working with children who are struggling with the transitioning of a parent's relationship? In the question, it's specified as a transition from a monogamous relationship to one that might include multiple partners.
That's a really good question. There's some really good, honestly, there's some really good support groups online for those consensual non-monogamous relationships and resources that I could find a couple, and if that's okay, I can send it to either you or Kathy and you can email it out. Absolutely. I can definitely do that.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anthony, for the presentation. Thank you to all the participants. We really appreciate it. We want to remind you that we'll send you a link that will take you to a recording of this webinar. You're welcome to share with your colleagues, as well as a copy of the slides. You will also receive a certificate of attendance for having participated in the webinar. That will come in your email. Give us a few days to get that to you, and we'll also send the resources that Dr. Zazarino was just mentioning. So thank you again, be well, and take care of yourself and each other. going forward. We hope to see you again soon. And thank you again to Dr. Zazzarino.
Thank you all.